You're probably using someone else's card. There's no way someone like you has this kind of money, said Kyle Evans. His voice filled with smug disbelief as he waved Layla Wright's bank card like it was counterfeit trash. The words didn't just sting, they shattered the air. Conversations in the lobby of Key Bank stopped cold. A child clutched his mother's hand tighter. An elderly man turned slowly toward the counter. And Layla. She stood completely still, as if the world had paused around her, her calm expression unable to hide the fire rising behind her eyes. But before we continue with what happened next, where are you watching from? And if this story already has you holding your breath, take a second to subscribe to our channel. Tap the like button so more people can hear stories that matter, stories that reveal truth, expose injustice, and remind us of the quiet power of standing tall when the world tries to shove you down. Now, back to Layla. She had walked into the sleek, glass-fronted branch in downtown Atlanta with a simple mission: withdraw $10,000 from her nonprofit organization's account. The money had been hard-earned, grants, donations, community support, and was intended to fund the opening of a literacy center for underprivileged children on the South Side. Layla, a 52-year-old former teacher, now ran the South Grove Community Initiative, a nonprofit that had become the heart of her neighborhood. She didn't look wealthy. Her blouse was pressed but plain, her shoes sensible. Her purse was functional, not fashionable, but she walked with the quiet assurance of someone who had built something from nothing, someone who had taught hundreds of children to read, someone who had kept her dignity even when others tried to strip it away. Kyle Evans didn't see any of that. The moment she approached his counter, his eyes scanned her outfit, then her skin, and his posture shifted, condescending, dismissive, as if she were wasting his time. When she handed him her ID and debit card, she said politely, "Good morning. I'd like to make a withdrawal. Please, $10,000. Kyle didn't even glance at her identification before scoffing. $10,000? Seriously? You expect me to just hand that over? Layla replied calmly. It's from my organization's account. The funds are for our youth reading program. He looked her over again, this time with open suspicion. What organization doesn't look like you run anything? He said, eyes narrowing. This card could belong to anyone. Do you even know the account number? Layla felt her hands tighten slightly but kept her voice even. Yes. It's under the South Grove Community Initiative. I'm the director. My name is Layla Wright. You can verify it in your system. Kyle smirked, shook his head, and muttered loud enough for others to hear. Right. Another story. You people always have one. That did it. A wave of shame and disbelief rushed over Layla's face, but she refused to lower her head. She straightened her shoulders and asked, I'd like to speak to a manager. Sure, Kyle said with a grin. Let's bring someone who can really explain why this isn't gonna happen. A moment later. Victoria Allen walked over from her office. She was tall, composed, and wore a navy suit so precisely pressed it could cut glass. But her eyes never once met Layla's. She walked straight to Kyle and asked. What's the problem? Kyle replied. Possible fraud. She's claiming this is her account, but nothing checks out. It doesn't feel right. That's a lie, Layla said, stepping forward. All my documents are here. Just verify the information. I've banked here for years. But Victoria didn't bother. She gave Layla a quick glance, then turned back to Kyle. Do you feel unsafe? She asked. I feel like she's trying something shady, he replied. Crossing his arms, Victoria looked back at Layla, tone flat and final. I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. What? Why, Layla asked, the shock rising in her throat. You haven't even checked my account. We reserve the right to refuse service, Victoria said coldly. And right now, your behavior is making my staff uncomfortable. My behavior, Layla said, voice shaking. I've said nothing inappropriate. I've simply asked you to verify my identity. Please, that money is for children. Victoria didn't respond. She turned and signaled to the security guard. Mason, please escort this woman out. Mason Stewart, a large man with broad shoulders and a badge that read Private Security, approached without a word. Layla's voice rose, not in anger, but in sheer disbelief. You're making a mistake. This is my account. Mason didn't care. He took her by the arm and began to guide her away. Don't touch me, she said sharply, pulling back. But it was too late. Her ID and bank card fell from the counter onto the tile floor as Mason ushered her past confused and silent onlookers. One woman clutched her purse to her chest. A man in a flannel shirt pulled out his phone and began filming. Layla was pushed outside, the glass doors closing behind her with a finality that felt like a prison gate. She stood on the sidewalk, chest heaving, blinking back tears. Her hands shook as she reached into her purse. She tapped a number on her phone, one she knew by heart, and raised it to her ear. Charles, she said, her voice low but steady. You need to get down here, right now. They just kicked me out of your bank. Outside the bank. Layla Wright stood with her phone clutched in her hand, her breath still shallow, her eyes scanning the faces that passed her by as if looking for proof that she hadn't just imagined the whole thing. But the humiliation was real. She could still feel Mason's grip on her arm, still hear Kyle's mocking tone, still see Victoria's cold eyes brushing her off like she didn't belong. Inside the glass doors. The air was still thick with tension, but to Kyle Evans and Victoria Allen, the storm had passed. I swear, Kyle muttered with a smirk, shaking his head as he returned to his station. These people think they can just stroll in and pull one over on us. Victoria chuckled dryly, straightening the cuffs of her blazer. It's always the same, loud, emotional, and entitled. She's lucky we didn't call the cops. What neither of them noticed was that someone had already pressed record. Elijah Edwards, a 60-year-old retired mechanic with a slow gait and sharp instincts, had watched the entire encounter from one of the lounge chairs near the teller line. His phone now captured the smug laughter of Kyle, the clipped, dismissive tone of Victoria, and the ease with which they joked about throwing a woman out who had done nothing wrong, without a word. Elijah uploaded the video to TikTok. The caption read, "Black woman kicked out of Atlanta bank while trying to withdraw her own money. Hashtag discrimination, hashtag this is America." Within minutes, it began to spread. Outside. Layla took a long, steadying breath and looked up. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not where they could still see her. Instead, she dialed a second number. Dylan. It's Layla. I need you to tell Charles it's urgent. Tell him it happened again. Dylan Parker, Charles's executive assistant. Didn't ask questions. He heard the weight in her voice and was already grabbing his keys. Meanwhile, inside. The mood had relaxed. Kyle leaned against the counter, recounting the event to a coworker, embellishing it with sneering flair. You should have seen her. Acting all righteous, probably printing fake IDs in her basement. Victoria's face twitched into a grin, but the moment was interrupted by a voice behind them. Excuse me. Harper Thomas, a white woman in her mid-50s, with silver streaks in her chestnut hair and a librarian's quiet strength, stood with her arms folded. I was here the entire time. That woman was calm, respectful. She gave you everything you asked for, and you threw her out because she didn't look the part. Victoria rolled her eyes. Ma'am, this is not your concern. Harper didn't flinch. It is now, because I'm a customer, and I'm filing a complaint. You humiliated someone in front of all of us. Victoria's professional smile returned like a mask. You're welcome to do so, but we take safety very seriously, and our staff felt threatened. By a woman in a blouse and flats, Harper snapped. You felt threatened by her ID. Mason approached quietly from the side, His arms crossed again. His presence made Harper pause, but she didn't step back. "You should all be ashamed." Behind her. A few murmurs of agreement stirred the crowd. Elijah, still recording, caught the entire exchange. His video now had over 8,000 views and climbing. Comments poured in. "Typical. She handled that better than I would have. This is why we don't trust banks." Victoria, growing nervous, whispered something to Kyle, then pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she said aloud, loud enough for everyone to hear. She was suspicious, and now this is escalating. Elijah caught that too. Outside. Layla saw the flashing lights before she heard the sirens. 2 patrol cars pulled up to the curb, lights spinning but sirens off. Officer Gabriel Collins, a white man in his 40s with a tired face, stepped out of one car. Officer Aubrey Scott, a black woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes and quiet confidence, stepped out of the other. Gabriel approached Victoria first. "We got a report of possible fraud and a public disturbance." Victoria nodded sharply. "Yes." She presented suspicious documents. "Made a scene. We had to remove her." Aubrey turned toward Layla. Her tone was different, softer, curious. "Ma'am, can I speak with you for a moment?" Layla nodded. "Please, I want someone to listen." Aubrey stepped aside with her and said gently, "Can I see your ID?" Layla handed it over without a word. Aubrey examined it, then looked back at the bank. "And the account South Grove Community Initiative." Layla replied, "You can look it up. I'm the founder. This was a legitimate withdrawal." Aubrey believed her. She didn't say it out loud yet, but it was in her eyes. Gabriel, meanwhile, was beginning to ask more questions inside. "Did you verify the ID? We didn't need to," Victoria said curtly. It didn't feel right. Gabriel raised an eyebrow. "You mean you didn't even check the account?" Before Victoria could answer. A sleek black SUV rolled up to the curb. The driver's door opened. Out stepped a man in a tailored gray suit, tall, commanding. Eyes locked onto the glass doors of the bank like a missile. The crowd shifted. Phones rose into the air. Harper's jaw dropped slightly. "Is that?" she whispered. Elijah, still filming, whispered back. "That's Charles Phillips, CEO of First National." And just like that, the temperature inside the bank dropped 10 degrees. Victoria went pale. Kyle froze mid-sentence. Mason took an unconscious step back. Layla didn't move, didn't speak. She simply looked up at her husband and nodded once. Charles nodded back. He turned toward the doors and said, calmly but with steel in his voice, "Open them. Inside." No one moved. I said, "Open the doors. Now." And with that, the tide began to turn. The moment the glass doors unlocked with a heavy click and Charles Phillips stepped inside, the entire energy in the bank shifted. Conversations stopped mid-word. Fingers hovered over keyboards. Kyle Evans stiffened like a man who'd just realized the floor beneath him was cracking. Victoria Allen turned to stone, her clipboard nearly slipping from her hand. Mason Stewart, who just an hour ago had escorted a woman out like she didn't belong, now stood frozen, as if unsure whether to salute or run. Charles's eyes scanned the room, not hurried, not flustered, but calm and calculating, like a man used to walking into boardrooms and knowing the room was already his. Dylan Parker, his assistant, followed behind with a leather folder tucked under his arm. Silent, but alert. The security cameras blinked overhead. Phones were still raised in the lobby, and Elijah Edwards was still recording, his lens now fixed on the unfolding reckoning. Layla, now back inside with Officer Aubrey Scott beside her, stood slightly apart, her expression composed but unreadable. She had said nothing since Charles arrived. She didn't need to. He knew. Charles didn't approach the counter or ask permission to speak. He addressed the entire bank with the quiet power of a man who had spent decades building something and wasn't about to watch it be tarnished by the people paid to protect it. "I'm Charles Phillips," he said evenly, "President and CEO of KeyBank." A gasp rippled through the customers. Harper Thomas whispered. "Her husband." "I knew it," Charles continued, his voice clear. "10 minutes ago, your staff forcibly removed my wife, Layla Wright Phillips, from this building. She was attempting to make a legitimate withdrawal from a nonprofit account tied to this very institution. Not only was she dismissed without verification, she was insulted, humiliated, and physically handled without cause." He paused, letting the words settle like bricks. "I'd like an explanation." Victoria tried to recover, stepping forward with the remnants of her professionalism. "Mr. Phillips, this was a misunderstanding. Your wife, Miss Wright, presented documents that seemed inconsistent. Our teller followed protocol." "Did you verify her identity?" he asked sharply. "Did you check the account?" "We didn't get that far," Victoria stammered. She became agitated. Charles's tone didn't rise, but it sharpened. She became agitated because she was being treated like a criminal. She presented her ID, her card, and account information. That's all she should have needed. Kyle opened his mouth to speak, but Charles cut him off without even turning to look. "Don't. You've done enough." He stepped to the counter and gestured to Dylan. "Pull the transaction log and the customer profile for South Grove Community Initiative." Dylan moved quickly, accessing the system with authority. Within seconds, Layla's account appeared on the monitor. Active, verified, healthy balance. Her name was listed as primary account holder. The screen didn't lie. It never had. Charles turned to Gabriel Collins and Aubrey Scott. "You've reviewed the situation." Aubrey nodded. "We've heard both sides. From what I've seen, there's no cause for legal action against Mrs. Phillips." "Good," Charles said, then turned back to Victoria. "Because the legal action will be coming from us." The crowd began to murmur again. Elijah was still filming. The view count was climbing into the hundreds of thousands. The hashtag Justice for Layla was trending. Harper stepped forward and addressed Charles directly. "Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but I saw everything. Your wife was calm. She was respectful. It was your staff who escalated. And when she asked for help, they treated her like she didn't exist." Charles nodded, gratitude flashing briefly in his eyes. "Thank you. Your voice matters more than you know." Layla stepped beside him now. She didn't need protection. She needed to be seen. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice steady. "It's about every person who walks into places like this and is told, without words or with them, that they don't belong, that their money isn't good enough, that their skin is suspicious. This happens every day. I just happen to have someone in power to call." Her words silenced the room. Even Mason lowered his eyes. Kyle's face was flushed, his smirk long gone. Victoria's hands were trembling slightly now, her composure cracking at the edges. Charles looked around. As of this moment, the branch will be undergoing a full internal review. All involved parties will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation. If we determine this was not an isolated incident, and from what I've heard, it wasn't, there will be permanent consequences. Victoria opened her mouth again, desperate. "With all due respect, sir, I was following bank procedure." "No," Charles interrupted. "You were following your assumptions. There is no policy at this bank that gives you the right to ignore protocol, skip verification, and humiliate a client based on a feeling." Dylan handed him a printed copy of the account verification and security footage request. Charles glanced at it, then turned back to his staff. "I expect written statements by end of day. Effective immediately. You're relieved of customer-facing duties." The color drained from Kyle's face. Victoria looked like she might faint. Mason took one slow step back, suddenly aware that the cameras were still rolling. Layla looked toward the crowd, her eyes landing on Harper. Then Elijah. "Thank you," she said simply, "for being witnesses." Elijah gave her a thumbs up. Harper smiled, tearfully. Gabriel Collins signaled to Aubrey that their part was finished. No arrest, no charge, just the truth, finally taking center stage. Charles reached for Layla's hand. She took it, without hesitation. Together. They stood in the middle of the bank that had tried to erase her, and now had no choice but to reckon with her. Charles Phillips didn't yell. He didn't have to. His voice, calm and deliberate, echoed across the polished lobby with more weight than a shout ever could. "Victoria, Kyle, Mason, you will explain yourselves, fully, and right now." The three of them stood under the glow of the overhead lights, suddenly small, their earlier arrogance now stripped bare in front of dozens of customers, 2 uniformed officers, and a smartphone audience that had grown into the millions. Victoria Allen tried to square her shoulders, tried to regain her composure, but her voice betrayed her. "Mr. Phillips, I was acting out of caution. We've had fraud cases recently, and the situation felt off." "Off?" Charles asked, his voice razor-sharp but steady. "What about it felt off? The ID, the debit card, the account verification she offered, or was it simply the fact that my wife doesn't dress like a hedge fund client?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "I followed protocol." "No," Charles interrupted, his eyes locked onto hers. "You followed your bias. You saw a black woman in modest clothing asking for a large withdrawal, and instead of doing your job, verifying the account, you assumed she didn't belong. You made a judgment based on appearance, and in doing so, you disrespected not only a customer, not only my wife, but everything this bank claims to stand for." Harper Thomas stood off to the side, hands folded, quietly nodding. Elijah kept filming. Officer Aubrey Scott shifted her weight subtly, arms crossed, visibly moved by Layla's composure. Victoria swallowed, but said nothing more. Kyle Evans, who had once spoken with so much confidence, now seemed unable to meet Charles's gaze. "Sir, I didn't mean anything personal. You just made assumptions." Charles cut in. "You mocked her, called her a scammer, smirked while you dismissed her credentials, and now you're hiding behind excuses. It's unacceptable." Mason, the security guard, remained silent, his arms no longer folded, his posture now defensive rather than authoritative. Charles turned to him next. "You forcibly removed a woman from this building without verifying anything. Did she yell? Did she make threats?" "No." She stood her ground. "And you treated her like a criminal. Why?" Mason looked down. "I was just doing what the manager told me." Layla finally stepped forward, her voice clear, unwavering. "And that's the problem. Mason, you didn't ask questions. You didn't hesitate. You just followed orders. That's how injustice survives. Because good people do nothing." Her words landed with a weight that no one in the lobby could ignore. A young black woman near the back of the room wiped a tear from her cheek. An older couple nodded silently. Even Gabriel Collins, the white officer, seemed visibly affected. Layla turned toward the growing crowd and continued. "I didn't come here today to make a statement. I came to withdraw money to open a reading center for children. That money was earned honestly, through community work, donations, grants. Do you know what it feels like to fight for every dollar, only to be told by someone behind a desk that you don't look like you should have any of it?" Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't pause. "I've been a teacher. I've worked with mothers trying to read their child a bedtime story for the first time. I've stayed up past midnight writing grant proposals so kids in our neighborhood could have books, not bullets. And today, I was dragged out like a thief. Not because of anything I did, but because of what they saw when they looked at me." The silence in the lobby was now complete. No tapping keyboards, No whispered conversations. Just the sound of truth hanging in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. Charles placed a hand gently on Layla's back. Proud, but not surprised. He stepped forward again. "Effective immediately," he announced. "Victoria Allen is suspended from all managerial duties. Kyle Evans, the same. Mason Stewart. Your contract with this branch is terminated. HR will follow up within the hour, and legal will be in contact regarding civil liability exposure." Victoria's mouth fell open. "Wait. You can't." "I can, and I am," Charles said without emotion. "I gave each of you an opportunity to tell the truth. You chose to lie. You chose to protect yourselves instead of this institution's values. There's no place for that here." The lobby erupted into soft applause. Customers who had stayed silent now stepped forward. "That's right," someone whispered. "Finally, someone doing the right thing." Elijah's live stream comments were coming in by the second. Accountability. Say her name, Layla Wright. This is what leadership looks like. Victoria. Face flushed and fists clenched, took a final step forward. "This is personal. You're only doing this because she's your wife." Charles turned slowly. "You're wrong. I'm doing this because it's right. But make no mistake. When you disrespected my wife, you disrespected me. And the only thing worse than your conduct is how confidently you wore it." Victoria's face twisted. "You'll hear from my lawyer." "Good," Charles replied calmly. "Mine will be waiting." Harper stepped forward then, addressing Charles directly. "Mr. Phillips, I'd like to say something. What you did today, what your wife did, it mattered. It's been a long time since I saw someone in power actually do the right thing." Layla gave her a grateful nod. "Thank you for speaking up when it counted." Harper smiled through misty eyes. No one deserves to be made to feel small for trying to do something good. Charles turned to Elijah. "Keep recording. The world needs to see how this ends." Elijah gave him a thumbs up, never lowering the phone. The final blow came from Dylan Parker, who stepped forward and handed Victoria a manila envelope. "Documentation of your previous formal warnings for customer mistreatment," he said calmly. "We'll be filing this with the board as part of the termination package." Victoria looked down at the envelope, her breath catching as the reality sank in. This wasn't just suspension. This was the end of her career. On camera, online, and in front of the very people she had once brushed off like dust. And then she turned, heels clicking against the marble, and stormed toward the exit. But even as the doors opened, she threw one last glance over her shoulder, eyes burning with resentment, as if promising she wasn't finished yet. Victoria Allen's heels clacked violently against the marble as she stormed out of the bank, but her rage didn't end at the glass doors. Within the hour, she was on the phone with a labor attorney, claiming wrongful termination, gender bias, retaliation, anything she thought might turn the tide back in her favor. But she was too late. Elijah Edwards' video had already passed 2 million views, and the story had been picked up by 3 local news outlets by the time the sun began to dip behind the downtown skyline. Screenshots of Victoria's face, caught mid-sneer, and Kyle Evans' mocking expression were plastered across headlines with titles like "Black Woman Denied Service at Bank," "CEO Husband Steps In and Caught on Camera," "How Bias Almost Ruined a Community Project." Layla hadn't asked for the spotlight, but she refused to waste it. That afternoon, she returned home with Charles and Dylan, where the house phone rang non-stop, reporters, activists, even former students calling in support. Meanwhile, inside the branch, Charles moved swiftly. The HR department was called in. Internal files were reviewed. It didn't take long to discover that this wasn't Victoria's first incident. 2 complaints had already been filed against her in the past year. both from older black clients who felt they'd been treated with unnecessary scrutiny. Those complaints had been quietly dismissed by middle management. Now, they were being re-examined. Kyle Evans submitted a half-hearted apology via email. 3 sentences of vague regret and a final line that read, "I didn't mean to offend anyone." Charles didn't even respond. Instead, he had Dylan forward it to legal. Mason, perhaps the most visibly shaken by the day's events, mailed in his badge with a handwritten letter. In it, he admitted to acting without thought, apologized sincerely, and asked for nothing in return. Layla read it quietly and set it aside, unsure how to feel. At the heart of it all was a simple truth she couldn't ignore. He hadn't thought to protect her because he'd never been trained to see her as someone worth protecting. But while some ran for cover, others stepped forward. Harper Thomas, the retired librarian who had spoken up inside the bank, organized a group of First National customers to submit formal complaints to the regional board. "We're not canceling the bank," she told the local news. "We're demanding accountability, real accountability." Her words struck a chord. Letters poured in, posts trended, customers told their own stories of quiet humiliation, of being overlooked, of being asked twice for ID when others were asked once. What happened to Layla had exposed something larger than one branch. It had exposed a culture, and people were no longer willing to accept it in silence. Layla, for her part, remained grounded. When the media came knocking, she didn't lash out, she didn't grandstand. She spoke plainly, calm, measured, direct. "This wasn't the first time I've been looked at like I didn't belong," she told a local reporter. "But it was the first time they did it in a place my husband leads." And that contrast is exactly the problem. "I shouldn't have to be married to a CEO to be treated with basic respect." That clip aired on national morning shows the next day. By then, Layla's story had become a symbol, not just of racial profiling or bias, but of quiet strength, of dignity, of a woman who didn't raise her voice, yet moved a nation. At First National's corporate headquarters, board members took notice. Charles held a series of emergency meetings, working with Dylan and a team of compliance officers to draft sweeping reforms. Layla wasn't just the reason for the change, she became part of it. At Charles's request, she agreed to serve as a community advisor, helping develop new training protocols for frontline staff. "We don't need sensitivity training," she told the board. "We need human training. We need to teach people to stop and ask questions instead of making assumptions. We need to retrain their eyes, because too many of them are blind in ways they don't realize." Her words were met with a standing ovation. Even Elijah, who'd kept a low profile since his video exploded, reached out privately to say, "Thank you. I just hit record," he said. "But you changed something." Charles, though relieved by the reforms, never lost sight of the personal cost. One evening, he found Layla sitting quietly in their kitchen, flipping through a binder of proposals for the community center. He sat beside her, placing a hand over hers. "I hate that this happened to you," he said softly. "I hate that they made you feel small." Layla looked at him, her voice gentle but firm. "They didn't make me feel small. They made me feel tired, but not small. I know who I am. Charles. I always have." And she had. From the moment she stood on that sidewalk after being thrown out, to the moment she looked those employees in the eye with grace, not rage. Layla had never let them take her dignity. She had simply redirected the spotlight from humiliation to purpose. Meanwhile, Victoria Allen, still clinging to what was left of her pride, appeared on a late-night talk show claiming she was being scapegoated, but the public wasn't buying it. A follow-up report revealed inconsistencies in her previous employee evaluations. Her lawsuit never materialized. Her reputation, once polished, faded into whispers and closed doors, in contrast. Layla's voice only grew louder, but never angry, never bitter, just honest. She was invited to speak at community events, schools, even a state conference on equitable treatment in financial institutions. And with the money she had fought so hard to withdraw, she finally broke ground on the South Grove Community Literacy Center. It wasn't just a building, it was a symbol of everything she had endured, of what she had built, of what she would leave behind. As the foundation of the South Grove Community Literacy Center took shape, so too did the deeper understanding of the woman behind it, for the public. Layla Wright had become a symbol of dignity under pressure, a figurehead for a broader movement about justice in everyday spaces. But for those who knew her best, none of this was surprising. Layla had always been the kind of woman who did the right thing, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Long before she married Charles Phillips or stood on national television speaking about systemic bias. Layla had been a high school English teacher in a small brick building on the east side of Atlanta. Her classroom walls had been lined with second-hand books, faded posters of Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, and sticky notes with quotes handwritten by students who never imagined their words had value. She had taught generations of kids to believe in their voices, even when society didn't. She had walked them through grammar lessons and grief, SAT prep and suspensions, poetry and poverty, and when her school closed due to budget cuts, when she stood in that empty classroom for the last time with tears in her eyes and chalk dust on her palms. She didn't retreat. She pivoted. She founded the South Grove Community Initiative with little more than a laptop, a folding table, and the belief that literacy could be a lifeline. She worked from her dining room table, writing grants, mentoring teens, and holding weekend reading groups under a shade tree in a borrowed churchyard. She didn't do it for attention. She did it because she'd once been a girl who read by flashlight under thin blankets, whose mother worked 2 jobs and never had time for bedtime stories. She did it because the world often tells black women to be silent and grateful. But Layla knew silence was a cage, and gratitude should never come at the cost of one's dignity. Now, as bricks rose and windows were framed in the community center she had fought so hard to fund, Layla stood at the construction site each morning, greeting workers, answering questions, and sometimes quietly crying when no one was looking, not out of sadness, but from the overwhelming weight of what it meant. One morning, she received a letter from Mason Stewart, the former security guard who had escorted her out of the bank. The handwriting was neat, if unsure. Inside, he wrote, "I've been watching the news. I see now what I didn't see then. And I'm sorry. Not because I lost my job, but because I finally understand that I was part of something much uglier than I realized. I've started volunteering at a food pantry near my apartment. I don't expect forgiveness. Just wanted you to know I'm trying to be better." Layla folded the letter gently and placed it in a small box marked "Letters to Keep." She didn't reply. Not yet. But she didn't throw it away either. Kyle Evans, on the other hand, had remained silent until one afternoon. He showed up at the construction site, hat in hand, eyes lowered. "I'd like to help," he said, voice hoarse. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I've been volunteering at the city library, helping with literacy programs. I want to do more. I want to earn back something. Not from you, but from myself." Layla studied him for a long moment. Then she gestured to the stack of donated books needing sorting. "Start there," she said. "No shortcuts. Harper Thomas, now a board member of the nonprofit, laughed later that day when Layla told her the story. "You have a way of making people see themselves. Layla, whether they're ready or not." At KeyBank, changes were no longer symbolic. Under Charles's leadership, the company rolled out a new system of training called Bias at the Counter, co-developed by Layla and a team of social justice educators. It was mandatory for every employee, executives included. It included case studies, real-world stories, and role-play scenarios that made staff confront the moments they'd dismissed in the past as instinct or policy. The first video in the series began with Layla's calm voice. What if the person you're judging is the person who funds your future? What if the stranger in front of you has already made your world better, and you just can't see it yet? The bank's customer satisfaction scores began to rise. Complaints decreased, and Charles made sure the reforms weren't just performative. He hosted quarterly town halls with clients from underserved communities. He listened, he made changes, and every time he stood at that podium, he thought of the day his wife called him, not with fear, but with that quiet command in her voice. You need to come now. One afternoon, Layla sat down with a young woman named Trinity, a college freshman who had once been in Layla's after-school reading program. Trinity now interned at the community center and had dreams of law school. Ms. Wright, she asked, how did you stay so calm when all that happened to you? I think I would have screamed. Layla smiled. I've spent my whole life learning to stand in rooms that weren't built for me. Screaming might get their attention, but silence, steady silence, often holds more power. I let the truth speak louder than my anger. Trinity nodded, slowly. I want to be like you someday. Layla chuckled softly. No. Love. Be better than me. Start where I ended. That's how we rise. And rise. They did. With every brick laid on the center. With every child who walked through its future doors. With every employee retrained. And every heart humbled. Layla's quiet stand on that bank floor had become a blueprint for something far bigger than justice. It had become a foundation. 6 months later. The grand opening of the South Grove Community Literacy Center drew a crowd that wrapped around the block. Neighbors, former students, local officials, and families who had never met Layla Wright but had watched her story unfold from behind glowing phone screens and nightly news segments. A banner stretched across the brick entrance, where stories begin again. Beneath it stood Layla, wearing a simple white blouse, a soft gray skirt, and a smile that carried the quiet weight of everything she'd been through. Her husband, Charles Phillips, stood beside her, no longer as CEO of KeyBank. He'd stepped down 2 months earlier, handing the reins to a woman of color he personally mentored. But as a husband, a builder, a man still humbled by his wife's strength. Dylan Parker was there too, now heading the bank's community outreach division, shaking hands with teachers and organizers, telling them this center was just the first of many. Harper Thomas stood near the back with a clipboard, still sharp, still fierce, now a full-time board member and volunteer coordinator, gently directing guests and handing out bookmarks with Layla's favorite quotes. And Elijah Edwards, who once pressed record on his phone without knowing what it would spark, now stood behind a modest camera rig, capturing the day for a documentary crew that had flown in from New York. Never thought a TikTok would turn into a movie. He laughed to a group of students nearby. But I guess when the story's this good, people pay attention. Inside the center, sunlight poured through tall windows, illuminating shelves of brand new books, rows of computers, cozy reading corners with beanbags and throw pillows, and a mural painted by local youth, a vibrant, swirling portrait of Layla holding an open book, with images of children, trees, and butterflies rising from its pages. At the center of the mural, in bold script, were the words she had once whispered to a frightened teenage girl. Start where I ended. That's how we rise. It wasn't just art, it was testimony. As the crowd gathered for the ribbon cutting, Layla took the small stage, her voice soft at first, but carrying with the ease of someone who had taught in crowded classrooms and church basements. 6 months ago, I stood outside a bank wondering if my life's work had just been erased with a glance. She said, But I learned something that day, and every day since. When we stand in truth, when we meet hate with purpose, when we choose to build rather than break, we leave behind more than pain. We leave behind possibility. The applause came in waves, some gentle, some thunderous. Trinity. The college student who had once sat wide-eyed at Layla's kitchen table, now stood at her side as program director for youth mentorship. She wiped away a tear, then raised the scissors to cut the ribbon, Layla's hand resting gently over hers. The tape fell away, and with it, so did the last weight of that terrible day at the bank. Inside. The first children entered, 6-year-olds with 2 big backpacks, 10-year-olds tugging their parents' sleeves, wide-eyed teens scanning the shelves like treasure hunters. The smell of fresh paint mingled with the rustle of pages, the echo of laughter, the hope of beginnings. Mason Stewart, the former guard who once removed Layla from the bank, now arrived quietly with a crate of donated books, his second of the week. He didn't ask for a spotlight. He simply nodded to Layla and walked them inside. Kyle Evans came too, this time wearing a volunteer badge. He still carried the weight of what he'd done, but every Friday, he showed up to tutor reading and math, starting with the students who struggled the most. Layla never fully embraced him, but she didn't push him away either. She believed in consequence, but also in change. And Kyle was changing across town. KeyBank had become a different place. Employees now underwent quarterly empathy workshops, many led by facilitators who had once been clients. Bias reports were now handled transparently, not hidden in back rooms. Clients of all backgrounds reported feeling safer, seen, respected. The branch where it all began was renovated, and a plaque was placed near the entrance. Small, discreet, but powerful. It read, "This building stands as a promise that respect is not earned. It is owed to every person, every time." Aubrey Scott, the officer who had chosen to listen instead of judge, began mentoring young black women interested in law enforcement. Gabriel Collins, her partner that day, started a reading group with his son at the center every Saturday. And Layla, who had once stood outside that bank feeling invisible, now walked through her community as a beacon. She spoke at conferences and schools, but always came home in time for Monday morning staff meetings, where she brewed the coffee and asked about attendance like nothing had changed. But everything had. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long golden shadows across the hardwood floors of the center, Layla and Charles sat in the reading room alone, watching a group of children laughing over picture books. Charles reached for her hand. "You built something." "Layla." She squeezed his fingers gently. "No. We built something. And it's only the beginning. Outside." The sign on the building lit up for the first time. Clean, proud, glowing in white letters against deep red brick, the Layla Wright Community Hub, and beneath it, a quote etched in stone that would greet every child, every adult, every soul who walked through its doors for years to come. One stand can change everything. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us tell stories that matter.